Holocaust Memorial Day is one day, and here at Union Chapel Church we're taking the theme of one day can be today. Now sometimes the horror of genocide can be portrayed as something extraordinary that only happens in the most extreme of circumstances. You may have heard that popular saying that the birds don't sing at Auschwitz. Well, of course this isn't true. The birds do sing at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The horrors of genocide are a part of our world, not a separate reality. Hate is a part of our world and something that we need to be active in challenging today. This evening we will be hearing from survivors of genocide who have been using poetry as a powerful means of expressing their grief, their hope, and their call on all of us to do more to prevent genocide. These poems will be read to us by Nicole Acquah, a storyteller, playwright, spoken word artist and actress, who produces her own work at theatre company Acquah & Co., focusing upon championing and celebrating Black British voices. We're also going to be thinking about the atrocities that have been inflicted on Indigenous communities. And we'll be hearing music from Sagrada Familia, Mulhall in the Indigenous Aymara language, which means sacred or holy family. This is a group formed of family members, Kanti Thaxi, both members of the groundbreaking fusion band Lacandis, and their son Ryan. And together they will be playing traditional instruments from the Andes. And as we explore hate in the world today, we're pleased to be joined by our guest speaker, Dr. Mulhall, who is one of the UK's leading experts on far-right extremism. He is head of research at the UK's largest anti-fascism organisation, Hope Not Hate, and author of Drums in the Distance, Journeys in the Global Far-Right, British Fascism After the Holocaust, and the International Alternative Right. Thank you to all our participants today for joining us, and thank you to all of you who are joining us for this important topic. You would also be most welcome to join us on Sunday morning at 11 in the church as we remember the Holocaust and subsequent genocides in our weekly service. I hope you all have a programme that are available by the door. We're going to be following through the order on that programme, and I hope that this event is one that challenges and inspires you and that you are able to get something from. So thank you all for joining us today.
What Would You Do? By Nicole. What would you do if your town was bombed and everything near was gone? What would you do if you were cold and alone and cast to the streets without a home? What would you do if someone killed your mum and dad and you had lost everything you had? What would you do if you were shattered and broken because you had witnessed the unspoken? If you ran, where would you go? If you died, would anyone know? I myself would pray and hope for a better day. Hear Me Now by Familia. Peaceful times have gone away, long gone, so far, far away. Let me live as I will you. Peaceful times as we once knew, the young, the old, so sad these days, so sad, so scared are we. I have closed my eyes to run away to peaceful days. Mother, please stay with me. Don't go, please stay close to me. I need you now to help me see the days of peace for me. Help me find those peaceful times, the times we laughed, when we were free. No more pain, be at peace. Thank you.
you very much. We are Sagrada Familia, Sumahayu in the Quechua language. That means Holy Family. I think family, well, I'm very sure family is the most important for the life, for the world. Everyone, we have our holy family, so we have to look after. To make a change in the world, I think it's that start. little fragment, a composition by Katharine. And the second part was Condor Pasa, a very well-known popular song from the Andes. Daniela Lomia's composer. The next is a beautiful melody from Colombia, and the arrangements special made for Sagrada Familia, Sumajailu, by Bryan Muñoz from Colombia.
Victims of war and genocide, though not with us now, we know you're at peace. We who survived will remember you. 10 years onward, our hearts are still troubled by the lack of justice for survivors. Help our leaders, bringing peace and hope, also preventing the same tragedies. Will you join me now? Remember the lives lost. Will you join me now, pleading to all to learn the lessons that at any cost, genocide must end forevermore. Splendor of Truth by Mirsad Solakovic. Everything that we saw, heard and knew, we can't see now, and we no longer want to know. What happened, we knew, but we don't want to know now. Evil has repeated itself, and we fear that it will happen again. For but it is all because we fear to tell the truth. The truth is sometimes harder to tell than to experience. Why must one nation go through a path of suffering while the rest of the world turns a blind eye?
Thank you. Firstly, thanks hugely to the organisers for having me. It's incredibly touching to be in past and to follow such remarkable music and powerful poetry. I'm going to talk a little bit at length about Holocaust Memorial Day, genocide more broadly, and bring it up to date some of the challenges in the world today. So it won't be cheery, but hopefully it won't be boring. So tomorrow is actually Holocaust Memorial Day, which is the day that Auschwitz was liberated. When Soviet soldiers arrived at Auschwitz in January 1945, they encountered the massed belongings of an exterminated people. 88 pounds of eyeglasses, hundreds of prosthetic limbs, 44,000 pairs of shoes. When the Soviets first arrived at the camp, the camps, in fact, that made up Auschwitz, they seemed silent, if you look at the accounts, perhaps even abandoned, some people thought, and until the soldiers realised, of course, that the wooden huts that sprawled out for as far as the eye can see, if anyone's been to Auschwitz, it's remarkable. That as far as the eye can see, they were filled with dead and dying people. Upon seeing the soldiers, some prisoners hugged, of course, some kissed, some cried, but others were just too emaciated and exhausted to even move. And of course, the liberation of Auschwitz did not mark the end of the Holocaust. As the Allies advanced, the Nazis forced the prisoners who could stand to march further, to march them back westward to other concentration camps and further into German territory. These death marches killed a further 15,000 people, as many succumbed to the cold, were shot on the way, simply died of exhaustion. The Nazis' hunger for extermination and their desire to cover up their crimes forced people to march towards their own deaths once again. Mercilessly, of course, the rest of the camps were soon liberated. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp was liberated in April 1945 by British soldiers. Richard Dimbleby, father of the other Dimblebys, reported the scenes to a stunned nation by the radio. And he said, "Here, over an acre of ground lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and with no hope of life. Unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them." Despite the news of the Nazis' final solution actually reaching Britain originally in 1942, the haunting scenes that Richard Dimbleby talked about were so inconceivable that the BBC at the time actually hesitated in broadcasting them until it had been confirmed by newspapers the next day. However, newsreels of course then followed, and the famous images of British bulldozers moving mounds of corpses in Belsen was seared into the public consciousness in 1945. And by the time the death camps of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, and the concentration camps of Bergen-Belsen, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Dachau, Mauthausen and Ravensbrück had finally closed their gates, marked Albert McFry, and the final solution had its final end, the numbers were staggering. 6 million Jews and 200, or between 200, and 500,000 Roma and Sinti people were dead. A further 1.9 million non-Jewish Polish civilians also perished, many in concentration camps and death camps. A further 250,000 disabled people were murdered during the barbaric T4 program. Many thousands of LGBT people were forced into brutal persecution, castrated and murdered at the hands of the Nazi regime. Tragically, after the war, the Allies chose not to remove the Nazis' amended paragraph 175 from the Constitution, which criminalised homosexuality. And neither the German states afterwards, Austria, or the Allies recognised homosexual prisoners as victims of the Nazis, which of course then stopped them, a status which was essential to qualifying for reparations. And even more sadly indeed, after the war, gay men continued to serve their prison sentences. after the fall of the Nazi regime in many cases. Of course, numerous other groups faced persecution and mass murder during the Holocaust. Black people, of course, Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses, political opponents and trade unionists, and so-called asocials, including beggars, alcoholics, drug addicts, sex workers, pacifists, all faced unimaginable persecution and often death at the hands of the Nazis. The numbers murdered were, of course, unconscionable, but they are not merely numbers. Of course, these were people, these were humans. Each of them had their own personalities, their own dreams, their own aspirations for their own lives, all of them snuffed out by fascism. Whole families turned to ashes in the crematoriums of concentration camps. Those who survived were forever scarred, many racked with an undeserved guilt, brought about not by wrongdoing, of course, but by simply living. Writing his memoir, Night, the Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel wrote, "For the survivors who chose to testify, it's clear. His duty is to bear witness for the dead and for the living. He has no right to deprive future generations of the past that belongs to our collective memory. To forget who would not only be dangerous but also offensive. To forget the dead would be killed a second time." Now, of course, this is why we're here today, in some senses. Together this evening is to ensure that they are not killed that second time, to ensure that we are remembering them. And by the time the cannons fell silent across Europe in 1945, the leading architects of fascism were, of course, dead. But with much of Europe turned to rubble, few families left untouched by the horrors of the war, and the newsreel footage of Jewish bodies being pushed into trenches by bulldozers, seared into consciousness. To this day we still see those images. Many understandably thought that fascism was dead, that it would die with its founders. And of course, unfortunately, that was not the case. Fascism survived the Second World War, though changed, it survives to this day. In 1946, there was a British journalist called Frederick Milani, who was a journalist, an author, a writer, and he stated that in the midst of the uncertainties and hazards of war, we thought one thing was for certain. Fascism had its day, and there could be no comeback. Unfortunately, the idea that there would be no comeback was, of course, encapsulated in the famous phrase, never again. For some people, never again meant never again when the Jewish people face a genocide. For other people, it was a more universalist declaration, that no one should face genocide. Unfortunately, of course, the latter certainly proved not to be the case. Holocaust Memorial Day is also to remember the tragic and growing list of subsequent genocides. These horrifying events that unfortunately have betrayed the hollowness of the international community's declarations of the slogan of never again. Just to run through some of them, we don't have time to go into great detail, but of course, Cambodia, between 1975 and 1979, well over 2 million people were murdered in Cambodia. From executions, disease, exhaustion, and starvation at the hands of Pol Pot and Khmer Rouge. Ethnic minorities also faced, of course, persecution by the regime. These include ethnic Chinese, Vietnamese and Thai people, and people from those ancestries. Religion was outlawed, churches with Christians were murdered, Buddhist temples were desecrated and smashed, and barely any functioning monasteries were left in Cambodia by the end of the crisis. All political and civil rights were, of course, abolished. Children were taken from their parents and placed in separate forced labour camps. Factories, schools, universities and hospitals were shut down. Lawyers, doctors, teachers, engineers, scientists and professional people of any field were murdered together with their extended families. There was a famous saying that the Khmer Rouge used, which was, "To spare you is no profit, to destroy you is no loss." Now, of course, it's not the end of genocide in the 20th century. Rwanda in 1994, just 100 days, approximately 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were murdered in the genocide of Rwanda. The genocide took place following decades of tensions between Hutus and Tutsis and a recent history of persecution and discrimination against the Tutsis. Tutsi men, women, children and babies were killed in their thousands in schools and churches. Frequently the killers were people they knew, their neighbours, workmates, former friends, sometimes even relatives through marriage. And I'll come back to that theme in a second. Then, of course, in the 90s, genocide returns to the continent of Europe, something that everyone thought in some senses was unconscionable after the Holocaust. How could it return to Europe? And of course it did. The Bosnian War resulted in the death of around 100,000 people and the displacement of over 2 million men, women and children. There was ethnic cleansing, there was genocide, much perpetrated by the Bosnian Serb troops under the orders of Slobodan Milosevic, Radovan Karic and Ratko Mladic. In July 1995, Bosnian Serb troops and paramilitaries led by Mladic began shelling the town of Srebrenica, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And on July 11th, Mladic claimed Srebrenica for Bosnian Serbs, and on the 12th of July, Bosnian men and boys over the age of 12 were forcibly separated from women and children and were deported, they were deported on trucks. The violence and killing culminated in a massacre on the 13th of July and lasted for about 72 hours, when around 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were murdered in and around Srebrenica. Many were shot in the act of trying to escape. Their bodies were then bulldozed into mass graves and concealed. There's a theme here: mass murder followed by bulldozing bodies into graves. However, genocide is not just, unfortunately, a historical phenomenon. It's not merely something to look back upon with horror, to memorialise and remember. It's something that continues to this day, of course. Darfur, again in 2003, a civil war began in Darfur between the population of black African farmers and the nomadic Arab populations. The Sudanese government supported Arab militia who destroyed hundreds of villages and murdered thousands of people. The civil war has led to the death of between 200 and 400,000 people. Numbers are incredibly difficult to work out how many people. Aid agencies have tried, governments have tried, it goes on. Up to 2.6 million people are still displaced in Darfur. When they talk about the genocide in Darfur, they talk about it as a genocide which continues to this day. Sadly, I just want to talk briefly about a genocide I went myself to see the fallout from in 2014. I went to Iraq to see the fallout of the genocide against numerous populations, especially of course the Yazidis at the hands of the Islamic State. ISIS had taken over the Sinjar region of Iraq. Women were sold into slavery, often men were turned into sex slaves. Children were sold as slaves and gifted to militants. People once again killed on an enormous scale simply because of their ethnicity and their religions. I'll never forget visiting refugee camps in northern Iraq and seeing the kind of unconscionable suffering firsthand. I visited an enormous camp called Karagosa, which was perilously close, right next to Mosul, right on the front line. It was enormous. There was 10,000 people living in this camp when I visited. It was more of a town, I would say, than a refugee camp that you would think of. And each night we would sit there as more people flooded across the border to try and find refuge. And I walked its streets and I would marvel at the ingenuity of these people that had turned these tents into homes and houses for their families. Some had added second rooms, third rooms, built off tarpaulins, used wood, anything they could find. They were attempting to turn these into new homes. Of course, most people would ignore me, understandably. They were tired of Western journalists turning up and giving them false promises, giving them false lies. But some people were willing to talk, some people wanted to talk, often about what would seem like mundane things, like the lack of television reception, missing their favourite shows, the lack of privacy amongst parents living in a tent with their children. But of course, winter was coming in Iraq. We think of it often as a hot country, but there was a lack of coats. Night it would ice over. It was raining, it was cold, it was freezing. Things were getting increasingly difficult. And one family invited me into their house and they said, come and see our home. As I walked in with an aid worker, they said to me, would you like a coffee? I don't drink coffee. But before I could say no, he said, please, you have to take it. This is the only thing they have left in the world to offer. Please take it. To my surprise, in some sense, the tent was more spacious than I had expected. It had a second room, it had TVs, it had a cooker, it had a fridge. And to reach their tent, I walked through bustling shopping streets with foreign exchanges, hairdressers, shops, electrical goods stores, people selling dollars and euros, and it was larger and more equipped than I might have imagined when I thought what this would look like to see in the first thing, but it actually had the opposite effect on me than I presumed it would. But what became evidently clear was that these people were probably never going home. The fact that they had concreted the floors of their tents was improvement. It meant that there would be less rain. It means that there would be less wet floors, but it also meant it was a recognition that those houses were probably going to stay there for decades. Those families and people were possibly never going to go home. They were symbols of permanence. Sadly, the people I met in these major camps were often the lucky ones. I went to see a camp right on the northern border of Iraq with Syria and Turkey called Vaughan. And in that camp, it was a makeshift camp open toilets right next to beds, people living on dirt floors, freezing cold. Dysentery in the summer was turning into hypothermia in the winter. There was no food deliveries. They were pulling together what money they could, anything they could, to go to local shops to buy food. They were forgotten people living on a hillside as the wind blew across. And they were even less lucky than the people that had tents that had concrete floors. I think the worst moment of all of it was in a small northern town called Acquah, where I walked into a derelict makeshift building that the war had smashed away the walls. The only thing that kept them warm to a certain extent was blue tarpaulins on the concrete walls. And they saw kind of Western journalists, and I was with aid workers, and they ran up to us and said, "You must come up, you must come." They took us to a room, and there was a young woman on the floor. They'd just done surgery on her. She had fled ISIS. ISIS had come into her village. She had fled across the border and had to walk for days. And as she walked for days, she eventually had a miscarriage and lost her child. And they did surgery on the floor trying to save her life, and she stood there on the dusty kind of floor, and there was nothing we could do to help. The aid workers radioed it in, there was nothing to be done, and she was almost certainly going to die herself there on the floor. And in that one story, I guess, after a week or so of seeing this suffering, that one story kind of really brought home the reality of the suffering and death that happens when genocide occurs, when people are forced from their homes. And of course, speaking to these people in the camps, it struck me how ISIS were not just killing people, the Islamic State were not just killing people, but they were tearing the fabric apart of centuries-old communities. And this is another side of genocide we need to remember. If you look at it, there was whole hosts. I'm not going to pretend for 1 second that Iraq was some sort of utopia before. The Ba'ath Party under Saddam Hussein persecuted people mercilessly. There was communities of Yazidis, Shia Muslims, Syriac, Chaldean and Armenian, Christians, Druze, Mandians, Shabaks. Some of those peoples had lived in those towns and cities for well over 1,000 years. But the ruthless expansion of the Islamic State forced those people to flee, of course. And these once mixed communities became destroyed. I spoke to some Christian refugees, and they said they had no intention of ever going home. And I go back to that thing about Rwanda, when people were murdered by their neighbours, by their friends and by their colleagues. These people, often these Christians and these Yazidis, and they were murdered, their daughters and wives were taken and turned into slaves by people that they lived next door to, that were their friends and their neighbours. It's too easy to think when we talk about genocides that genocide is perpetrated by monsters, these external monsters that arrive in some place and do awful things, but it's not. Genocide is perpetrated time and time again through centuries by people like you and myself. They're people who are captured by the politics of hatred, and they turn on neighbours and friends and they kill them and they murder them. In the case of the Holocaust, of course, it was systematic mass murder and rape. Holocaust and genocide is perpetrated by individuals like ourselves, and that's why it's so important we remember those crimes and we also continue to fight against them today. Whether or not it was the concentration camp guards at Auschwitz, whether or not it was the machete-wielding murderers in Rwanda, whether or not it was the Islamic State fighters just a few years ago, there were people who were radicalised by hate. And of course, these crimes continue to this day. In Myanmar, I'm sure you've seen newspaper articles about the Rohingya. Many have faced appalling abuse at the hands of the Myanmar military. Thousands of Rohingya have been murdered. 700,000 have fled into refugee camps in neighbouring Bangladesh since 2017 alone. In January 2020, finally, the International Court of Justice ordered Myanmar to take steps to prevent genocide in a landmark case that was actually brought by the Gambia. And of course, shockingly, as we mentioned, the Uyghurs in China. If we look at the province of Xinjiang, this is happening today. We see possibly as many as 1 million Uyghurs were detained in so-called re-education camps. We've heard about death, we've heard about sterilizations, we've heard about re-educations, we've heard about destruction of religious sites. This is happening right now as we speak. And we're just about to have the Winter Olympics in China. To this list of ongoing crimes, I could add places that are at risk of genocide, whether or not that's the Democratic Republic of Congo, whether or not it's what's happening in Ethiopia right now. I could go on. Now, of course, I'm not about to say that we're seeing this wave of genocide, but what I do want to come on to is contemporary far-right movements. Because genocide does not start with the gas chambers. Genocide starts with hate speech, it starts with discrimination and persecution, and it finishes in death camps. When I started actually getting involved in anti-fascism about 10 years ago, it was inconceivable to me then. When we were campaigning against the BNP in Dagenham and Stoke and Birmingham in the UK, we were trying to stop them winning councillors. We were trying to stop them winning councillors here and there, and it was inconceivable at the time that by 2020, well over 1.6 billion people around the world would live under governments run by radical right parties, whether or not that was Trump in North America, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, whether or not we look at the Law and Justice Party in Poland, whether or not we look at Fidesz in Hungary, whether or not we look at far-right parties in parliaments across the continent of Europe, once again, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, Sweden Democrats in Sweden, Vox in Spain, I can go on, Le Pen in France with elections in April. Now, I'm not saying that these parties are necessarily on the road to genocide, but we know there is a pyramid of hatred and how these things work, and the politics of hatred, division, intolerance. If it's left unchecked, we know where this goes. How many more examples do we need to see this happening? And we're seeing it happening once again. Also, of course, we're seeing a wave of far-right terror. People don't just die in genocide, people die from politics of hatred on a daily basis around the world. And I often think back to the deadliest far-right terror attack in recent years was, of course, in New Zealand. In March 2019, when the far-right terrorists burst into Friday prayers at the Al-Noor Mosque in Christchurch, killing 51 and injuring a further 49 people. And the reason I touch on that example is because it was perpetrated by an Australian. But that Australian, when you look through the documents that were released or that he released and wrote about them, he was inspired by the actions of a British terrorist called Dan Osborne, the school murderer from Sweden, Anton London, talked about Dylan Roof, the American killer. He talked about the Norwegian mass murderer, Anders Breivik. He used ideology from British fascists from the past, like Oswald Mosley. He took ideologies from the European identitarian movement, American neo-Nazi scene. And when he burst into, he himself, of course, spent time in Bosnia and France. He travelled the world, each of these places where he picked up politics. And when he burst into that mosque and he murdered those people, of course, he murdered New Zealand, people from New Zealand, Muslims from New Zealand, but he also migrants and immigrant communities and individuals from Bangladesh, Malaysia, Turkey, Pakistan. It goes on and on. And the reason I mention this example is because when we talk about the threat we face today, it is a global threat. The killer in Christchurch was an act of terrorism by an individual against a group of people, but it was inspired by a global movement, a global far-right movement. When we talk about the contemporary far-right and the danger it poses, it is an international movement, and that's how we have to understand it. Now, as I say, I'm certainly not claiming 1 second that the rise of the far-right is necessarily or inevitably going to lead to further genocide. But we do know that the politics of hatred and division is creating ever more fragmented, divided, anti-egalitarian politics. Here in Britain, we continue to have a hostile environment for refugees, migrants, minority communities, immigrant communities. So now is not the time for complacency. The pillars of liberal democracy in many places around the world are wobbling. Now, the reasons for this are extremely complex, and probably now is not the time to go into them. I could talk about economics, I could talk about culture, I could go on and on, and anyone who says it's a simple answer to this is not telling you the truth. But one of the key reasons here is that not everyone who voted for Trump or Bolsonaro or Modi or any of these parties, not every one of them was a fascist, not every one of them was a racist, but they certainly didn't care enough about the politics of hatred, about racism, about misogyny, otherwise they wouldn't have voted for them. And I think this is the key point here. When it comes to it, why we're in some senses losing those of us that believe in progressive and egalitarian politics is often because not enough people care. People don't necessarily agree with these people, but they don't mind the more pernicious elements of their politics. And I do think this is where we can find hope to kind of finish on. In most of these places, people that disagree with this sort of politics remain in the majority. We are a majority. And as a result of that, if we do stand up collectively and oppose this sort of politics, we can win. And we will win. And we have won. And we will win again. So, on this week of Holocaust Memorial Day, there will be churches, there will be synagogues, there will be mosques, there will be prisons, there will be schools, there will be church halls all over this country where survivors will go and speak and tell their stories from the Holocaust, from Rwanda, from Bosnia, from other genocides. And so yes, we of course need to remember those people that died, so that they don't suffer the killing again, as Elie Wiesel said. We also need to remember those individuals that survived, those people that are remarkable testaments to the human spirit. Many of them will go, when you go and see a survivor talk, they will bring their children. Some of them will bring their great-grandchildren and their grandchildren. Huge testaments to the human spirit, because as many of these people, they continue to live. Of course, never unscarred, but they did continue to live. And HMD is a day to remember those people as well. And finally, I think Holocaust Memorial Day is a day to remember where the politics of discrimination and hatred live. And here's a moment which is, I guess, a call to arms to ourselves. Yes, we have to remember history. Yes, it's right that we light a candle tomorrow night to remember the victims of genocide. But it's also a day to recommit ourselves, to say what are we going to do to try and stop the next one. And only by doing that will we turn never again from this failed slogan that we hear constantly, that politicians trumpet all the time. Only then will we turn never again from a failed slogan into a reality. And that involves all of us recommitting ourselves to make sure that when we see fascism, when we see discrimination and racism, we don't become the bystanders and we become active participants to try and fight back. So thanks again for having me. Tomorrow's Holocaust Memorial Day. There's a national event will be available online, I think at 7 o'clock. There's a national moment where you can light a candle. If you have one, put it in the window. And let's remember the history of genocide, but also let's commit ourselves to try and do something about it in the future. Thanks very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Harley will come over the microphone to you. But just while you think of your questions, I want to say a big thank you for that comprehensive history of genocide, what leads to it, how we need to be active in opposing it. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
That's a special Jewish event, Yeah, that's a special time to reflect on this terrible thing, But as you said, it still continues today, And I read so many books, recent books as well, on the genocide of the Native Americans. There's young girls, even today, every week found in rivers and things like that in Canada, and they've found lots of remains from the church schools. Even recently, I went down to the Canadian embassy and I put a picture of a Native American child, And there's been thousands of remains even being found today of children that died in Christian schools, or Catholic schools, And I think you mentioned China, which is, I think China is terrible. It's really terrible. And what they've done to Tibet is just disgusting. I've seen videos, of Tibet, and I just think it's very terrible, And I think it's great that you're here tonight, speaking about all this. And let's just pray for peace. And, like I say, it never happens again,
Yeah, and just to be clear, I kind of was doing the Holocaust on, but you're absolutely right, of course. I mean, if we had a day, we could go back, and they're endless, whether or not we're talking about the situation in Armenia, whether or not we're talking about indigenous populations in North and South America or Australia, and we could go on through the lines of imperialism, etc. So, I certainly wasn't attempting to leave those out. It was just that I had to start somewhere, otherwise we would be here all night.
Oh yeah, and I also saw a film, and because you reminded me of when you said you'd been to these places, war zones and stuff. There's a journalist who died. There's a film made of I'm ashamed I can't remember her name now.
I know what you mean,
Yeah, and she died. She lost an eye first, and then. So I got this video just a few weeks ago from a charity shop, and I thought it was amazing. You know, this woman going into the war zones, you know, talking to the people that are suffering there. And I just recently come across a book that was in the charity shop as well.
Yeah. There's a film of that as well.
Yeah, and I've just got the book, and yeah, I'm going to read it. Because you know, it makes me human, you know, and you know, to realise, you know, how bad the world can, you know, people can be. You know, not everybody, but like you said, people that have the power, you know, or the people that are voted for, you know, and how these people get votes, you know, it's just. Oh, I'm not saying anymore. Thanks very much.
No, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you. Cheers.
Sorry.
We'll get the music's back in a second, don't worry.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your organisation? And secondly, can you tell us about some of the most powerful techniques or campaigns or something that you've seen that's just really stood out in terms of something that someone has done and has really inspired a community, a group, beyond what you might have expected?
Yeah, sure. So I work for an organisation called Hope Not Hate. Hope Not Hate is an anti-fascist organisation, anti-racism organisation. We do various things. I work with the research team, and our job is monitoring hate groups, extremist, violent extremist groups, mainly in the UK, both online and offline, but we also, of course, do around the world as well. And our job is finding ways to monitor them, work out how dangerous they are, and then find ways to combat them. And we also have community organising teams that are based or spend time around the country, so we do election campaigning, but also long-term community organising in the communities that are susceptible to this sort of politics. And there's also an education unit whose job is to spend time in schools, which we say kind of what's one of the things we can do is start early with education. There's a couple of things. One of the great things, unfortunately the side I work on at Hope Not Hate is primarily looking at nasty people doing terrible things. But so that I sometimes miss out the hope bit, and I end up just focusing all day on the hate bit. But in terms of the hope bit, there's some campaigns which have kind of stunned me. We did a campaign in Dagenham in 2010 where millions of pieces of literature, and why it was so inspiring was because it was a community that had been ignored, right? You'll see a lot of these communities where the far right take hold is not because people there are just innately more racist. They're often Burnley, Stoke, Dagenham, these were places, these are communities that have been ignored for decades and decades by mainstream political parties, presuming they had nowhere to go, and they were economically impoverished, there was deindustrialisation, jobs had gone abroad, all these sorts of things had happened, these communities were poverty-stricken. And the BNP would knock on their door, right, and say, well, I'll tell you why that is, it's because these people have arrived, immigrants, etc. It's a very powerful message when they went to the hopeless and gave them hope, and the hopeless, if we get rid of these people, life will change. And a lot of it, I think, is about empowering communities. It's about going into those communities. It's not about lecturing them and saying, you're wrong, look how racist you are. It's about going after the racists, let's be honest, we should do that. But like a lot of these people, a million people vote for BNP. We don't have a million Nazis in the UK. And I always think back to a campaign that was in a big town block in East London. Knocked on the doors and said, what are you interested in? And a lot of these people who lived in that tower block didn't know their neighbours, the lift didn't work. It was one of these really run-down places. And the BNP would knock on the door and say, we can fix this for you, we can sort this out. And so we some colleagues of mine got them all together and said, let's have a meeting and talk about what it was. It was a relatively small thing, they wanted their lift fixed, right? There was an elderly woman that lived quite high up and she couldn't walk upstairs. So we get the MPs to turn up, we get the councillors to turn up, we had a barbecue, they meet their neighbours and then get the lift fixed. And it sounds like a tiny thing, but I think these victories are these incremental victories in re-empowering those communities to change their lives for the better is how these things happen. They're doing it themselves. So the next time the election, the BNP knock on those doors and say, no one listens to you, we'll listen to you. They turn around and say, well, actually, I spoke to my MP last week. Actually, I spoke to the councillors the week. We actually got our lift fixed. When I was speaking to my neighbour, we organised a barbecue. We decided what we cared about and we got it done. And so it's not just about saying we're going to go in and fix these places. It's about going to those communities and working with those people and listening to what they care about and empowering them to make decisions. And once you give those communities power, they turn them from the powerless and the hopeless to the hopeful and the powerful, and they're much less susceptible to the politics of the far right.
you can dislike that person, you can dislike the person who so hate and not human being. I've never forgotten that.
No.
But anyways.
It's just thinking about the current politics in the UK, sort of slippery slope towards authoritarianism. I mean, where would you locate the current sort of process of legislation at the moment? And things like the protests, the changes in electoral reform, changes to the citizenship and the immigration. These are concrete things that are going through Parliament now, which will have an impact on certain communities, particularly. Do you see this as something which is part of just a shift between one party and another in the democratic process? Or do you see it as a sort of movement towards something which we ought to be very thankful?
It's a great question, and I think it's the latter. Right? I think there's a whole suite of legislation, as you say, things like the Nationalities and Borders Act, some of the rhetoric coming in the Home Office around cross-channel migration, as you say, the curtailment of the rights and freedoms of protest and those democratic rights being curtailed. There is no doubt there's a direction of travel which is moving away from towards kind of more authoritarian politics, more discriminatory politics. And I think there's two things that normalisation and mainstream. In certain cases, we've seen examples around the world where individuals and groups from the traditional far right, individuals that would have traditionally been beyond the cordon sanitaire, as they were called it, have been allowed back in. That wall has crumbled. The anti-fascist consensus has crumbled. And we're seeing that in places like Sweden, for example, where the far right are talking to the conservatives, etc. And we see that in the UK, for example, with far right figures being invited onto national radio stations to talk about migrant communities and undocumented migrants, as though they're kind of experts on this topic. So there is that mainstream process, but far more prevalent in the UK is this normalisation, which is taking the politics of the far right and it becoming normal in mainstream politics. And as you say, some of it now is being codified in legislation, whether or not it's the current stuff that's going on around taking away citizenship without giving people notice. Over 400 people who were last week lost their citizenship. And I've certainly got very little, as you just heard, no time for people going forth the Islamic State. But the problem is the kind of codification of that in legislation ends up being a situation where these things can happen behind closed doors. There is a whole suite of legislation, even things like the Online Safety Bill, which in many ways are positive, put way too much power in the hands of the government, way too much hand in it, etc. So we are moving on. And back to your kind of question, the way we fight this is by empowering people, empowering communities, giving people a chance to make change, etc. A lot of this legislation is getting in the way of it. And things that, whether or not it's the Home Office talking about putting gunboats on the channel, this is stuff that I think the BNP would have balked at in 2010 for putting in the leaflets. They would have felt, you can't get away with that. And now we're hearing it coming from the Home Office. So yeah, there's a whole suite of legislation. The direction of travel is extremely important.
Question over here.
Hello. I'd just like to ask you, Joe, about the sort of remit of these world agencies such as United Nations. Is it time for them to be reset? They seem to be they don't seem to be entirely competent at managing these peace missions.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because in some sense, I mean, the UN is such an enormous organisation that does, in some cases, absolutely remarkable work. I mean, you go to camps, etc., but the ground level work is staggering. But I actually, I had a meeting with someone from UNHCR that deals with refugees, and I was stupid. Right? And taking that cross-channel migration, like the British government breaking international law around the arrival of undocumented migrants, people dying in the channel, and the UN said nothing. Yes, they'll jump them down if something happens in China or they release a statement, etc. But of course, in some cases, when we talk about things like the Security Council, the Human Rights Council of the UN, in Saudi Arabia was on the chair of it a few years ago. There's huge contradictions. I would say that I think in the main, they generally can do amazing work, and they've done some amazing things which have stopped things getting worse in many cases. But it's not, we shouldn't be uncritical. In certain cases, they absolutely fail. They continue to fail. and we need to hold them to account. But I'd love to say I've got a better suggestion for you. But reset, maybe, I don't know what that would look like. But I'd certainly, yeah, not uncritical.
Do we have time for one final question? Yeah.
For our current climate, now having struggled, suffered, put up with, sustained 2 years of isolation, what do you recommend in terms of hope?
Recommend in terms of
That's it, that's all I have.
what I recommend. I don't think I have the expertise to recommend anything to anyone. The one thing I would say, actually, as you bring up the pandemic, is obviously it's awful, and there was some, it's incredibly hard for everyone, and it was abysmal for many. But there was some glimmers of hope, I thought, through the pandemic. So, what to recommend? People buying shopping for their neighbours, helping elderly relatives, and all those sorts of things. I do think it did expose the fundamental goodness of the human spirit. And so I guess if I had to recommend anything, it would be let's learn from that. Let's look at those positives. Let's look at those bits where people that have never spoken to their neighbours knocked on the door and bought them a toilet for 6 months. Those things there, because essentially it boils down to looking after each other. At the end of the day, if you know your neighbour, you spend time with them, it's much harder to believe lies about people from different backgrounds, different religions, if you know them, you spend time with them, if you work with them or live next door to them. So I think that would be the thing, to learn from positivity, because there was positiveness and there are stories of human spirit, ingenuity and friendship and love. And if we take those on the positive and we carry on doing more of that, I think that would be a better place.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Honestly, thank you for finding the hope to end on after such a difficult topic of the pandemic as well. And that actually leads us really well into our final pairs, which were 2 survivors who were able to find hope in the human spirit, which we're going to do now. But thank you again.
The Monsoon Rain by Zia Hiro Nayang. It is the source of human life in this world. Falls and pours on the farms, helps to grow the plants, showers the earth, greens the planet, makes the oxygen we breathe. Doesn't discriminate, only serves us. Helps us to grow the grains and fruits. Saves poor, challenged water crisis. But we only pour hatred on this world. We kill lives, the innocent. The earth is showered with bloods. Why don't we aim for humanity? Why do we discriminate against others? We don't love others. Likewise, we don't love ourselves. We pollute the earth, waste our own planet. Can't we pour humanity onto this world? We love our planet, the only earth we've got. We love others and help each other. We love our lives. We make our planet safe. We save the poor. We beat the cleansing in Bosnia, the folly of Muslim fanatics, and the cruelty of Pol Pot. In the love and compassion of the Creator, I do believe. I believe with all my heart. Fire and the kingdom of heaven will come, when man will conquer his destruction and learn how to live in harmony with nature and himself. I do believe. When all the preachers of hate will be silenced and man will become his brother's keeper, when man will stop killing man in the name of God, and nation will not lift weapons against nation. When this will be, I do not know. But despite the signs of the contrary, in the dawn of a better world, I do believe. Thank you.
Is so Chile. It's called The Departure. Next song is a traditional song from Peru. It's called Vírgenes del Sol, dedicated to the women, especially women, that was prepared for the arts in the Inca culture. Vírgenes del Sol.
uncles, some brothers, a great musician master from Chile, El Kid. He made an arrangement from a beautiful song from Violeta Tana. This song, Cara Pito. You know, I'm the one who played the piano. Is in this we don't need words. Music is one of and also, remember, everyone was a child, and the child has the future in this planet. We need to teach and this present as well. We need to teach.
family for being part of this event. Thanks to all. Thank you very much for all your invitation, for supporting us as well. Thank you very much to all in your chapter team. Thank you. And Katharine as well, thank you. It's a special medley. Has 3
you so much. I don't know where to begin. Let me begin by congratulating Katharine. Katharine started working here just a few weeks ago, and I said to her, the one thing I need you to do is to organise the Holocaust Memorial event, because I was going to do it before Christmas and I didn't get round to it. And she's done it, so thank you. Let me thank Nicole for the wonderful readings tonight. Hansi, Laxi and Riley. It is very welcome to your talent, Riley. I knew you played Karanga. I knew that you played flute. I knew you played bass. I didn't know you played piano. So thank you. Thank you so much. Very inspiring. Really very important. So thank you for coming. This is the first event we've held in the bar since lockdown. We're busy organising our Lent programme, so in March we'll have evenings like this throughout the month. Themes. So please look out on the website for our activities, particularly in Lent, when we'll be thinking of the theme of the beloved community, which was, of course, the phrase that Martin Luther King used. And we look at how we can create a beloved community. And it seems to me that the one thing we've done tonight is contribute to the beloved community.
Amen.
We've come to just sitting down and listening and thinking and hearing and reflecting is actually just the opposite of what the far right wants us to do. It's the opposite of genocide. Conversation, dialogue, poetry, thoughts, and music are the things that we need and we have for tonight. So thank you all very much. I hope you can stay and have a chat to drink. But thank you all for coming and good to see you again. I'm just going to do the last plug. This Sunday we will be remembering Holocaust Memorial in our service, and we'll have music, Jewish music from the composer Ernest Bloch. We'll have music, Roman music. We'll have music from the Resistance, and we'll have an improvisation on the poetry of Elie Wiesel. So that will be our service.